definitely when the cameras are away, you see certain countries who wouldn't be seen at all with next to Israel be very pleasant and understanding and sympathetic. And that's something perhaps that might change down the line in public, but for now it hasn't. The United Nations and its leadership have really strayed and they've ended up politicizing the institution and focusing on one member state, Israel, far too much at the expense of the rest of the 192 member states. And I think the UN is really reaching a critical juncture now.
For nearly 2 years, today's guest stood on one of the world's biggest stages, defending Israel at the United Nations during one of the most challenging periods in the country's history. He has debated hostile journalists, worked alongside world leaders and diplomats, and spent years studying the Iranian regime and the people fighting for freedom inside Iran. He's former Israel's international spokesperson to the United Nations. Today, I want to go beyond the headlines. Has Israel lost the information war? What really happens behind closed doors at the United Nations? And after everything he's witnessed over the past 2 years, what worries him most about Israel's future and what gives him the most hope? Jonathan Harounoff, welcome.
Thank you, Daniel. It's great to be with you.
I want to start with this. Do you think that Israel has already lost the information war? And if it wins militarily but loses global public opinion, can that truly be called a victory?
It's a really great question. And I would say in the kinetic warfare front, on all of the fronts that Israel has fought on and defended itself, it can legitimately claim resounding victories. However, when it comes to the informational war, when it comes to the war of public opinion in the West, I would say Hamas has very much won and the Islamic Republic is very much winning. And that's something that we need to continue to focus on. Unfortunately, there are only so many areas that a small country like Israel with its finite resources can focus on. And sometimes when you're weighing a tangible, imminent, existential threat that can actually claim lives, you're weighing that against informational war that's kind of intangible, but obviously pernicious. In most cases, the tangible material threats are going to win and going to demand the attention. But that doesn't mean that one should neglect the more intangible yet very nefarious threat that I think we've neglected to prioritize for far too long.
What do you think there are some of the biggest, let's say, lies about Israel that continues to be repeated around the world? And what facts do you think that the international media is refusing to tell about Israel?
I might have a slightly different way of framing this. I would say, my training is as a journalist, and I maintain that there are many, many journalists out there who do practice their work with good intentions. But there's a very serious information gap and access gap. And what I've found is that the vast majority of journalists that I've tried to cultivate a relationship with have been receptive to different ideas and perspectives and have incorporated it in their stories. But I don't think there are sufficient efforts being made to build those relationships. And of course, when there are certain journalists who have no intention or no desire to sort of report the truth. And those are the journalists that you just kind of have to steer clear of, and you know what you're getting yourself into. Then there's a whole universe of journalists working at different mainstream and less mainstream outlets who just don't know enough. And sometimes the things that they report can be completely erroneous, can be complete nonsense. Sometimes it's because they want to demonize Israel, but in many cases it's because they don't know any better. And I think there are more opportunities than ever to reach out to those places, to provide them with information, to give them opportunities to visit Israel, those kinds of things. And that's something that I've tried to focus on a huge amount. And there's a lot of work to be done there.
Do you think that facts still shape public opinion, or have emotionally powerful, let's say, images and videos become more influential than the actual evidence?
Fortunately, I think the memes and the videos and the tweets that are, just take seconds to digest are sometimes way more powerful than a fact-filled press release or a press conference or a report. And in many cases, especially at the UN, we saw that it took a couple of seconds for a lie, a very dangerous lie, to make its way around the world before the truth caught up. And one key example that I keep thinking about is around the time of a very important Security Council session, centered on Gaza and the situation there. A very prominent UN leader by the name of Tom Fletcher made some claims about tens of thousands of babies in Gaza being on the verge of dying of starvation and hunger within 48 hours. And by the time that was completely refuted, it had made the headlines in every single newspaper all over the internet, and it had really there was a direct correlation between a spike in Jew hatred all over the world and those kinds of sentiments. So in many cases, unfortunately, to your question, we do live in an age where things that are designed to outrage and provoke anger are sometimes much more potent than facts themselves, and that leaves people who are stewards of truth and interested in truth and want to share the truth in a kind of losing position, because the truth sometimes isn't as glamorous or as crazy or as outrageous as the lies. So we have to figure out ways to make the truth, package it as compellingly as possible as the lies.
On June 28th, you had an intense exchange on LBC over allegations that Israel deliberately targeted children. What was going through your mind during that interview? Did you feel that you were given a fair chance, or, this was just more like a prosecution?
I've had a couple of great encounters with LBC. I'll say I was an avid listener growing up as someone from London, and it wasn't a total surprise. I will say though, I was expecting and I was briefed on having a conversation about a completely different topic about Andy Burnham, because it was around the time that Andy Burnham was gaining prominence in the UK. So it did come as a bit of a kind of curveball. To Lewis Goodall's credit, there was space for a conversation and rebuttal, but I think it was abundantly clear that he had a certain perspective and it wasn't really going to change. But I do appreciate being given the platform and the invitation. I know there are some people who are really against, anyone being platformed. I'm of the opposite opinion. I think it's really important to have these spaces for people to share different perspectives, however outrageous they may be, and then it's the interviewers or co-panelists' duty to call them out. What I will say though is that interview did lead to a whole avalanche of hateful messages, and by really quite surprising people all over on social media, a number of DMs by people with the tech marks, people of prominence, sending quite horrific, outrageous messages that I won't embarrass them about. So I think that was perhaps more surprising than the interview content itself.
Now, how difficult is it to challenge, disputed statistics without appearing to dismiss genuine civilian suffering? How do you acknowledge the tragedy of, let's say, children dying while rejecting the accusation that Israel deliberately targets them?
Doing exactly what you said. I think you have to exhibit humanity. And sometimes there are people who deny that there's any suffering at all in any given situation. That's disingenuous. It's not authentic, and people can see right through that. This is, after all, a war. A war conflict by definition is unpleasant. There are people who are going to suffer, but what you have to clearly explain and demonstrate is the origins of the conflict, the motivations behind the conflict, and that's something that sometimes gets lost. Absolutely, there's been suffering in Lebanon, there's been suffering in Gaza, there's suffering in Iran, there's of course suffering in Israel. You can't deny any of that stuff, but you also have to contextualize it, explain who is causing it, who is the root cause of this, and why Israel is doing what it's been doing.
You mentioned that you believe on, going on different platforms no matter what. What about a platform like Piers Morgan, for example? Do you think that it educates viewers, or is it primarily like political theater?
I don't think anyone going or watching Piers Morgan is under any illusion of what the show is about. I think it very clearly is what it is. It's quite authentic in that way, that it's structured as a kind of a forum where people are sometimes pitted against each other with different views. It's not the way I usually conduct conversations, but I do actually see value in it. And I don't know exactly when our conversation now is going to air, but a couple of days ago, there was a Hamas spokesperson who was platformed, interviewed, grilled, I would say, by Piers Morgan. And there was a huge backlash as to why he was given the platform. I personally think that it was a good thing to give this individual an opportunity to demonstrate his own insanity, and Piers Morgan grilled him. It's not as if Piers Morgan was eulogizing or praising everything he was doing. He gave him this platform to hold him to account. Very rarely, I for one have very rarely seen Hamas spokespeople, Hamas leaders being interviewed in Western media outlets. And I think it was a very important thing to let the world see Hamas for what they are. So I think in answer to your question, no, Piers Morgan is a special kind of brand. I do see value in it, but I think people who are invited on that show know what they're getting themselves into. I don't think it's going to be entirely a surprise. Whereas if you compare that to LBC, LBC has different hosts. Some hosts are very pleasant. They have different styles, whereas anyone going on Piers Morgan is going to be interviewed by Piers Morgan, and they know who he is. So I, that's where I stand on this.
Now, has being a spokesperson changed the way that you judge journalists? Like before you were a spokesperson, did you have a different attitude towards it?
No, I always see, before being at the UN, I was a journalist myself, and I've always seen tremendous value in the art of journalism when it's practiced correctly. It's given me the role of the UN has been both disheartening in terms of seeing how some journalists operate and how some of them approach writing a story or in a very kind of cookie cutter manner, in that they just approach someone with a preconceived idea of what story they want just for a one sentence quote, and the story's already written, as opposed to other brands of journalists where they don't write the story before they've actually spoken to the people who are going to make up the story. And that's the kind of journalism that I really admire. And I saw both of those kinds throughout my time. So I think it's given me a deeper appreciation of the good kind of journalism that can exist, but it's also been disheartening to see the way some top journalists, or supposedly top journalists, execute their craft.
The latest Gaza framework is centered around Hamas's disarmament, a new Palestinian administration, and a phased Israeli withdrawal. Is this a genuine breakthrough, or is it another agreement, in your opinion, likely to collapse during its implementation?
I think time will tell. I think it's a breakthrough in that President Trump announced this and framed it as a breakthrough and said that Hamas agreed to disarm, which is quite a groundbreaking development. But that's one step which is done. But the next fundamentally crucial step is actually seeing Hamas disarm and verifying that they're disarming. And a lot of credit is due to President Trump's administration and to Nikolai Mladenov, who's headed the Board of Peace, for working to get to this point. But I think there's a lot of work ahead of us. And we've been in this position before where we have seemed to have reached a critical breakthrough, and Hamas has taken a page out of the Islamic Republic's playbook and stalled and lied and deceived and pulled the wool over the world's eyes. So I think just time will tell, but it's certainly encouraging if it can actually be executed and implemented as stated in the plan.
Do you think that Hamas could survive politically, even if it's forced to disarm militarily?
The way I see it is that Hamas cannot have a future in Gaza for the sake of the people of Gaza and for the sake of Israelis and for the sake of, if the Board of Peace and President Trump want to achieve the grand, ambitious projects that they want to achieve, that Hamas can have no place there. And my hope is that once Hamas is hopefully out of the picture, politically at least for this moment, the people inside Gaza and the people who are governing that area can see what kind of future could exist there with Hamas out of the picture, would no longer give them any ability to rehabilitate and reconstruct. But you're right. Even if Hamas is disarmed, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're completely defanged and powerless. So demilitarizing Gaza and disarming Hamas is one step, but actually making sure that it stays long term and that there's no avenue for return for Hamas is going to be equally crucial.
Is there a strategic disagreement between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu over how the Gaza framework should be implemented?
Well, I think there are complementary visions of different foreign policy items, and I think that's understandable because these are two leaders of two independent countries. But the vast majority of the time, and I think the White House meeting demonstrated it, the vast majority of the time, these are two countries that do have very shared values and shared concerns as well about the world. I don't think that there are fundamentally conflicting visions and strategic goals for Gaza. I think both leaders want to see a Gaza free of Hamas, and one that can actually, where its people can no longer pose a threat to Israel and no longer a concern. But if you're asking about exactly how they would go about reaching that end goal, Perhaps they may have sometimes differences of opinion, but I think that's quite natural. It's like a marriage or a partnership. There are the two people in that relationship who do get along sometimes have different ways of going about things, but that doesn't necessarily indicate a deep rooted issue. It just means that they're human who have different ideas and different visions, but they have that relationship so that they can talk it out. And that's, I think, also probably what happened in the White House as well, where these different scenarios were being hashed out.
Now, at this point, all the hostages, the living and deceased, have now been returned. What did the return of the final hostage mean for the Israeli society? Did that moment provide a sense of closure, or you think the wounds of October 7th are just too deep for any closure?
I think the wounds of October the 7th are tremendously deep, and I think they continue to kind of sear. You saw very recently relatives and spouses of October the 7th victims unfortunately committing suicide, and the mental health implications of October the 7th are really going to stay with this generation for a very, very long time. But absolutely, the return of the final hostage, Ron Gvili, if I recall, was definitely provided some closure, but I don't know if it provided absolute closure for Israeli society, because there's still the trauma from that day. There's still the implications from that day. I remember Ron Billy's sister visiting us at the United Nations, and we were holding a press conference with her, and of course it meant a huge amount to her family for his return, and I could see absolutely that there was a lot of closure for other members of Israeli society, that we can finally put this behind us. And then after that, if I recall the chronology, a lot has happened since then, unfortunately. If I recall correctly, then we had the return of Hadar Goldin as well. So we reached a point where there were no Israeli hostages in Gaza at all, even those who've been held for a decade or more. So that also provided another layer of closure. But for total closure, I don't think we're there yet. I think that's going to take a long time.
Of course, of course. Now, what did the hostage ordeal reveal about Hamas that much of the world still refuses to acknowledge? And obviously, they use the capturing of hostages as a tool. Is there a fear that this can be done again in the future?
It's very clear that it's a very lucrative, scary, profitable, dangerous tactic. And it's a tactic that's taken straight out of the Islamic Republic's playbook. It goes all the way, it can be traced all the way back to the hostage crisis, the 444-day hostage crisis that took place around the time of the Islamic Revolution in 1979, and where more than 50 American embassy workers were taken hostage. And then it proved to be very damaging. And ever since then, you've seen hostage taking become a kind of norm. That's the only diplomacy that the Islamic Republic has really engaged in for a prolonged period of time. It's why you see so many Europeans taken hostage and Americans taken hostage. There was the Israeli, also an Israeli academic who was taken hostage as well in Iraq as well by a Islamic Republic linked terror group. So there's a very clear linkage between the behavior of Hamas and the behavior of the Islamic Republic that the world sometimes doesn't really make the connection.
Now, you just stepped down from your role at the United Nations, but after nearly 2 years of representing Israel at the United Nations, what are some things that the public has no idea about? When the cameras are turned off, do the diplomats speak differently about Israel? What are your thoughts about your time there?
Yeah, it was a very tumultuous 2 years, and there were some good things that happened, and there were some terrible things that happened. Definitely, when the cameras are away, you see certain countries who wouldn't be seen at all with next to Israel be very pleasant and understanding and sympathetic. And that's something perhaps that might change down the line in public, but for now it hasn't. But the thing that I would perhaps focus most on is that the UN has a tremendous number of flaws. It has a lot of reputational, leadership, morality, financial challenges that it's facing. But I haven't lost complete hope in the UN. I think that the UN it has a lot of promise to it, and its foundational goal in the wake of the Second World War to prevent another world war from happening and future atrocities from happening. That foundational goal is one that I think is worth protecting. The issue is that the United Nations and its leadership have really strayed from that goal, and they've ended up politicizing the institution and focusing on one member state, Israel, far too much at the expense of the rest of the 192 member states. And I think the UN is really reaching a critical juncture now where it's facing a make or break year. And by that, I mean that now the UN is seeking its next Secretary General. Antonio Guterres, who's been leading the UN for almost 10 years, is wrapping up his term by the end of this year. And every single candidate on the shortlist has basically said that the UN needs significant reform, which is encouraging. And if they're able to actually rehabilitate and completely reform the UN and cut out the waste and actually get back to its original goal, then I think the UN is really worth saving. And also at the same time, there isn't really an alternative at this point. There are places like the Board of Peace, which has shown, I think, some promise with this breakthrough, the Hamas disarmament, but it's not positioning itself as a complete alternative to the UN. Its core mandate right now is Gaza. But what I do see value in is that the UN is seeing that there are other alternative institutions that are making significant breakthroughs that the UN is not doing. And the UN is very much on the sidelines. And I think that serves as a wake up call to the UN. So all of this is to say that the UN has a lot of flaws, but it has some promise. And I think we'll know exactly whether or not it continues to slide into a decline or it charts a new path in the next year or so.
Did it bother you that there was quite a bit of hypocrisy there? For example, you have countries on the Human Rights Council that have human rights violations themselves, but it seems like the public outrage is always about Israel. There are some countries that they're focused on and other countries they don't even discuss. Did that type of kind of hypocrisy or double standard bother you in any way?
It's quite maddening. Yeah, there was so much hypocrisy and contradiction and selective focus and selective outrage. I recall that it took when in December 2025, when the Iranian people started to rise up and you saw nationwide protests, and then followed by abhorrent, appalling slaughter of tens of thousands of people and internet shutdown. It took the Secretary General and his office more than 2 weeks to issue any kind of statement of condemnation or concern. Had that been something related to Gaza, there would have been a statement within a week, within an hour, my apologies. So there are definitely different timelines and different urgency when it comes to different situations and different people. And I think that's definitely is a cause for concern and something that I really struggle with because my focus, I was in Israel's international spokesperson for 2 years, but I've been a British Jew of Persian origin for 31 years. And to see the Iranian people be neglected for so long, people that I've written about extensively in my book and elsewhere, really was painful and disheartening to see. And I had personal experience of it as well. When my book came out last September, my publicist reached out to the UN's bookstore, which carries a lot of books written by UN officials on matters related to foreign policy or human rights or women's rights. And they got back to my publicist to say that my book on the Iranian women on human rights didn't fit with the UN's global priorities, didn't fit with their global agenda. And again, I found that to be quite mind-boggling and confusing. And then we later found out that Eli Sharabi's book, Hostage, also wasn't stocked there, but they had a whole range of other quite questionable books being stocked there. So there's a whole misalignment of priorities that I do struggle with. And I think that is symptomatic of or indicative of the leadership up at the top.
Does anyone inside the UN genuinely believe that Israel is treated fairly?
I would say that there are some people who would say that Israel is treated the way it deserves to be treated the way it is. I'm sure there are people who would say that. I'm sure there are people who would say that we aren't being aggressive enough about Israel. But in my sort of anecdotal conversations, I think there's a glaring recognition that the UN has a special kind of treatment reserved for Israel. And it feels sometimes like the UN just consists of one member state, Israel. Just given the volume of General Assembly sessions and UN Security Council sessions and press conferences, special rapporteurs and reports all focused on this tiny state. So it does sometimes feel like there's a disproportionate amount of attention on Israel.
Which country would you say that maybe surprised you the most in the positive way? Maybe there's an underrated ally inside the UN. Was there anybody that surprised you positively?
There are a lot of member states that are surprising. And one thing that that I found quite refreshing is every year the Israeli mission takes dozens and dozens of ambassadors from all over the world on a kind of educational trip, to a kind of March of the Living kind of trip to both Poland and then Israel, to learn more about the history of the Jewish people, and then the foundation and creation of the state of Israel, and then the rise of anti-Semitism and all of those kinds of things. And the level of engagement and interaction from countries on all continents is really quite extraordinary. And that's something that I wouldn't have known before this role. And there are countries in Africa, small island nations, in Europe, in Asia, and that's something that I hope we continue to see more of, this kind of cultural exchange and on the field interaction. I think that's where you learn the most.
What are you most proud of accomplishing during your time representing Israel at the UN?
The thing that I'm most proud of and also most passionate about is, apart from the hostages, and which was something that I'll never forget, bringing people like Eli Sharabi and Noah Al-Gamani and Mia Shem and Ilana Gruchevsky and all of these people into the United Nations at a time when the UN never came to them in their time of need. The thing that I am tremendously proud of is the work done with the Iranian people, bridging our peoples, the Jewish people, the Iranian people, and the Israeli people, and to highlight just how much synergy and commonality there is between us, and to very clearly distinguish between the Iranian people and the Islamic Republic. Too often people don't make that distinction, but one thing particularly that I did was on International Women's Day this past March, we invited 4 Iranian women into the United Nations to talk about their experiences under the Islamic Republic, and to talk about the relationship, the history that exists between our people. And that was a really momentous, unforgettable experience. And one person particularly who came, her name is Rahaleh Amiri, and she is a trained psychologist from the city of Kerman in Iran. She took part in one of the protests in November of 2022 during the Women Life Freedom Uprising. And she was shot in the eye by the Islamic Republic. And she came to the UN that day in March with her eye. She received critical eye surgery, and it's something that you notice immediately, but it's also something that she doesn't shy away from or hide. It's something that she wears proudly as her kind of badge of defiance towards the regime. And she's been using her immensely powerful platform to share more about her background and share more about the stories of the people of Iran. And so that was something that I really was proud to participate in, and something that I'm continuing to do now, even after my time, continuing to amplify the voices of the Iranian people, and to highlight the commonalities and the relationship and the history that exists between our peoples that go back thousands of years.
Does the Islamic Republic of Iran genuinely want a deal, or does it want relief, survival, and a time to rebuild? Do you think that they're weaker today than they ever have been, or maybe they're more dangerous because it feels that it's cornered, kind of like on its last breath?
I think it is at a point of weakness, but I think they're also that makes them very dangerous. I think they were underestimated in terms of how, I think there was sometimes an assumption that they would just fold, in the aftermath of a very intense operation, like in February, with the killing of the supreme leader. But I think what we've come to recognize, and something that I've understood for a long time, is that the lengths to which the Islamic Republic will go to survive. Then they have no problem suffering. They have no problem waging a war of attrition. And that's something that the Islamic Republic, I think that's been part of their strategy from day one. They knew that they weren't going to be able to take on Israel and the United States militarily in a kinetic conflict. But what they can do is they can wage this attritional war. They can hold the world's key waterways hostage, the global economy hostage. They can get some of their neighbors to suffer and to go to the United States and to beg them to stop. They can apply that kind of pressure. And on top of that, they're not a democracy, whereas Israel and the United States, of course, are democracies that are bound by public opinion, by the prices of fuel, the gas, by elections, by midterms. Like, these are all things that are not relevant to everyday life for the Islamic Republic's leadership. If anything, they don't care about public opinion. They'll just disappear or execute their own people at any whiff of opposition. So there's a very clear dynamic that's at play here. But I would say that the Islamic Republic is certainly weak, but their resolve and their determination has certainly been emboldened. And if the only motivation they may have for striking some kind of deal would be in order to survive, because they know that President Trump and his administration are not going to be around forever, and perhaps a subsequent administration, whether it's Republican or Democrat, might be more amenable to having a relationship with the Islamic Republic, like past U.S. administrations, and that perhaps might be something they're targeting. They're playing the long game.
What is behind this obsession with the Islamic Republic of Iran targeting Israel? Of course, we know they're behind Hamas and Hezbollah and all that, and they also, they're investing in this terrorism and forgetting about their own civilians, and they suffer in their economy and all these things. But what is the root cause of this? Why are they targeting Israel so much? I mean, since 1979.
Well, I mean, it's remained a non-negotiable fundamental pillar of the Islamic Republic, alongside a virulent hatred of the United States and a really intense subjugation of women's rights and minority rights. But I think it ultimately goes down to them it's hard to kind of encapsulate the way the Islamic Republic feels about Israel, because they don't recognize Israel. So they don't really have an opinion necessarily per se on an entity that they don't see existing. But to the extent they do see it existing, they frame it as the root of all evil. They're peddling all kinds of anti-Semitic theories, saying that a lot of the suffering and the evil that occurs in the world all around us can be linked back to Israel and the Jewish people and the Zionist regime, as they like to describe it. But I don't think that's ever going to change. Like, even if there's a deal struck, it's not going to be struck with Israel, because they don't recognize Israel. It will be struck with the United States. And what gives me confidence is that the United States very clearly recognizes the threat of the Islamic Republic, and they're not going to enter into an agreement that really allows the Islamic Republic to continue to build its nuclear program or threaten US assets or threaten Israel's security. And I think that's something that is really fundamental.
Now, you wrote a book recently. Can you tell us what was your motivation for writing this book, and what is your book about?
The book is called Unveiled: Inside Iran's Woman Life Freedom Revolt, and it came out last September of 2025 on the 3-year anniversary of the killing of Mahsa Jina Amini, who was the young Iranian Kurdish woman who was killed by the morality police in September of 2022, which sparked the massive Woman Life Freedom uprising. I'm sure you and your audience will remember, where women would cut their hair, and it was a real momentous movement. The reason why I wrote the book, apart from the personal connection to the region, is because of what we were discussing a bit earlier on, the fact that most people's reference points to Iran is the Islamic Republic. When you say the word Iran, to most people, that means ayatollahs, that means mullahs, that means regime, that means ballistic missiles, nuclear weapons, terrorists, whatever. But the reality is that Iran consists of a population of 93 million people, the vast majority of whom despise their regime and are more similar to us than we think. So my motivation for writing the book was to amplify some of the incredibly powerful voices, both female and male, voices inside Iran who have borne the brunt of the Islamic Republic. And the context in which the book was taking place was in the midst of this really huge uprising that took place that really shook the foundations of the Islamic Republic and served as a very existential threat to the regime, which is why they stamped down on it so severely.
Now, if you had to add a chapter or two in your book, what else would you update over there from seeing what you saw recently?
I wouldn't jump the gun. I wouldn't write another chapter just yet, because I think this story is it's continuing to unfold. But one thing that I might focus on a bit more is the incredible history of Jewish life in Iran, how vibrant it was and how it's shifted and transformed in the past 50 or so years. And the fact that, and many people don't know this, the fact even today, with everything going on, Iran still has the second largest Jewish population in the Middle East after Israel. There are still approximately 10,000 Jewish people living inside Iran, and they still have a chief rabbi. They have synagogues and kosher restaurants and all of those kinds of things. And of course, it's a different kind of Judaism that is practiced there, one that is very clearly distinct from Zionism or any support for Israel. And it's one where Jewish people have certain protections afforded to them as long as they disavow everything related to Israel and Zionism, and they take part in pro-regime rallies and all of those things. But it's a very it's a very interesting, different kind of Jewish community that many people don't know about. So I would write more about that. I don't think it's necessarily fits with the topic of my first book, but it's perhaps related to a subsequent book that I'm going to work on.
Do you think that Israel and a future free Iran could become close allies again? And what do you think of the day that Iran becomes free? How would that change the world?
Absolutely. I think it would completely change the Middle East. It would change the world. But it's also not something without precedent. We saw glimmers of hope before 1979, where you had a relationship there. You had constant flights between Tel Aviv and Tehran. You had tourism exchange, agricultural exchange, academic exchange. You had Israel sending a team of rescue workers to Iran in the early 60s, where there was a really debilitating earthquake that took place in the city of Kasvin. And the Shah allowed Israel to send a team of engineers to help with rehabilitation efforts. There's also a history, a very long history. It's why in many of Israel's major cities you have streets named after King Cyrus or Chov Kores. And there is a history there, and I think that's why when Israeli officials and Israelis in general post messages directly to the Iranian people and vice versa, that's what gets a tremendous amount of traction. It's not just because it's something that's kind of like interesting and perhaps not unexpected. I think it's also because it touches on this huge, deep history that is, I think, waiting to come out in a post Islamic Republic Iran.
Jonathan Harounoff, thank you so much for joining me. I truly appreciated our conversation. How can people follow you, purchase your book, and learn more from you?
Happy to hear from any and everyone, and fairly active on Instagram and LinkedIn and X. And the book is available at most bookstores, but also on Amazon and Target and Waterstones, wherever you are in the world.
Thank you very much, and wishing you the best of luck and success in your future chapters of your life.
Thank you so much.